We have listened to the summary and reflection in Chapter 3 yesterday. My role is to summarize and reflect on Chapter 4, which is entitled A Heart Open to the Whole World. To bring out the concrete embodiments of fraternity and social friendship in the previous chapters of Fratelli Tutti, this chapter talks about three main issues: the problem of migration, the giftedness of cultural encounters, and some questions related to globalization. Consistent with the Pope's reflection on the Good Samaritan, the main value that he wants to express is still on the centrality of ecstasis, or of love going out of oneself, which he applies to contemporary issues. Let me summarize the three main points. First is the issue of migration. To go to other countries for work, as many Filipinos do, is of course not the ideal situation. But since it looks like migration is here to stay for some time at least, the Pope advises the receiving countries with these four worded tagline: welcome, protect, promote, and integrate immigrants into these new countries. For example, for those applying for refugee status due to humanitarian crisis, we should simplify the granting of visas, or these countries should provide them with humanitarian corridors, give them decent housing, a full access to the justice system when needed, reunite them with their families as soon as possible, or ensure them the practice of their own religions. For those who have arrived in these countries for some time now, the Pope encourages governments to accept them as full citizens and avoid the use of the term minorities, which actually leads to discrimination and hostility. But the long-term view that the Pope envisions is to develop a form of global governance on migration, because this problem cannot be solved by one country alone. The second concern is to recognize the giftedness of cultural encounters. The arrival of someone different from us is actually not a threat, but an enrichment. When we open our hearts to those who are different, the Pope says, we also develop ourselves in new ways. For example, the United States has been enriched by Latino and Asian cultures, or in the Pope's experience, Argentina by the Italian migration. Or to use our own context, Philippines is a happy mixture of Chinese, Spanish, Arabic, and other cultures. Because a culture closed in on itself is going to die, is already dead. In a world characterized by xenophobia and narrow forms of nationalism, the Pope wants us to see the reciprocal giftedness of these cultural encounters. The third concern is on the relationship between the local and the global. While we open ourselves to other cultures in globalization, we should also appreciate our own cultural uniqueness. Thus, on the one hand, to avoid myopic provincialism, we need to embrace the global or the universal. On the other hand, in order to avoid being eaten up by strong global forces, we need to emphasize the local with its cultural uniqueness and flavors. The next question is, how do we contextualize these points in the Philippine situation? Let me mention three concerns. First, Chapter 4 of this encyclical is mainly an advice to receiving countries, mainly coming from the first world, on how to welcome and protect migrants from the third world. But migration in the third world context, like the Philippines, engenders other concerns. For example, the care of left behind families. It seems that our government only looks at the benefits of financial remittances that keep our GDP afloat by calling our OFWs mga bagong bayani, without taking account of the social costs these produce in their left behind families. One can never measure the pain of separation and absence this brings to children and couples. Second, the migration discourse in the Philippines also needs to consider internal displacements, those we call buckwheat, caused by ecological disasters which beset the Philippines every year. Typhoons like Yolanda, Rolly, Ulysses, and militarization, conflict, and development aggression, mainly on our lumad communities, which actually disturb peace and order in these local communities. In the recent survey, there are more than 4 million IDPs in the Philippines, or internally displaced persons, now living in relocation sites or refugee camps for years or decades. These humanitarian migrants in our midst has been neglected by this government. Third, the Pope's concern for cultural openness is rightly aimed at countering the narrow nationalist and violent populist movements that plague the US and the European continents. The arrival of someone different is in fact a gift, the Pope reminds us. But beyond this attitudinal and cultural injunction, we need to critique the hard political powers that make possible this act of othering, the process of marginalizing and silencing people who are different. In the Philippines, this present government consistently demonizes and effectively eliminates those who are different, the voices of dissent, and calls them terrorists or place them in the list of drug addicts and pushers, or red tag them as communists. The other week, a politician whose name was in their narco list years ago was shot in his municipal hall. The other day, a doctor who was red tagged years ago was killed. In Payatas, more than 100 people who found their names in the drug list were just killed in front of their children. There were many thousand others who were killed before them. What we have in our midst are not just racists who do not like other people. What we have are people of power who uses our country's resources to eliminate all threats in order to keep themselves in power forever. May God help us.